Hi everyone, and welcome to Jane Talks Murder, where I'll be talking about and reviewing an episode of Poirot, Murder, She Wrote, Diagnosis Murder, or Jonathan Creek. Today, I'm looking at Poirot, the A.B.C murders, or as I like to call it, that time Poirot got murder groupies. We begin the episode with a titular railway guide and a train coming in, and Poirot spots Hastings unloading his crocodile. We find out that he's been gone for 6 months, and Poirot hasn't had a case in that time, and they go back to Poirot's place, where Hastings presents him with the crocodile, which he's very polite about. Poirot shows Hastings a letter he received, challenging him to solve a case on the 21st, signed A.B.C. Hastings puts it down to a madman and points out that today is the 21st, and Poirot worries that someone will be murdered. So the next day they visit Jap, who checks if anything's happened, and turns out a woman in Andover was battered to death by the name of Alice Asher. The Andover police think Asher's estranged husband did her in, so Poirot flashes Glenn the letter and investigates the crime scene, where he finds the same titular railway guide. They nose through her stuff, noting some new stockings, and then leave, where Jap is annoyed by unhelpful eyewitness accounts. Oh, hello there, let's all have a nose. The doctor says the murder weapon was efficient enough to have been wielded by anyone before they drag crazy old Maurice in, who claims he's innocent, which Glenn doesn't buy, and has Mr. Asher arrested. Poirot thinks he's innocent because Alice would have been facing someone she knew, and they visit her niece, who is distraught over her death, and says her uncle often threatened to kill her aunt. Hastings says he wishes there was a clue, and Poirot points out the railway guide that had no fingerprints on it. Yes, thank you for the visual reference. And back home, Poirot receives another letter with another location and date, so they regroup with Jap and the other police. Jap wants precautions, but the Bexhill police say that's impossible, although they do try, and Poirot and Hastings go for a stroll. Dramatic B-zoom! Ooh, a fluffy doggy who barks up a storm at this dead woman, complete with railway guide, while another letter is typed, and Poirot wakes Hastings so they can go and have a look. Pose for a picture! They all scrunch along and go to speak to Betty's boss, who says her boyfriend's name is Donald, and they go to talk to her parents, who are broken up and also mention Donald. Meg and her sister storms in, so Hastings follows her, and she's quite cross, mentioning Donald's jealousy because Betty was often unfaithful, which frequently turned into violence. Poirot questions Donald, who admits to trying to track Betty down the previous night, but failing. And while that's a weak alibi, Poirot's not convinced of his guilt. While this guy watches Black Limelight, a 1938 movie, which is interesting, seeing as this episode takes place in 1936. Poirot and Jap argue over whether they should go public with the alphabet link. Jap wins, and is on the job apparently, and Poirot wonders if the killer has a personal grudge before another letter shows up, rocking the letter C this time. Poirot realizes today is the deadly day, and the letter was late due to a typo in the address, so they rush to the station to catch a train, and Jap surmises the mistake is because the killer drinks White Horse whiskey. Good job, dude! These two umbrella-wielding people are worried about Carmichael Clark. I'm sure he'll be fine. Oh wait, he's super dead. Cue the spinning newspapers, and Poirot thinks into the wind. He tells Hastings there is no connection between the victims, and they talk to Clark's brother, who says Lady Clark is dying, but nothing else out of the ordinary has happened lately. Hastings, stop leering at women and come look at the body. While Poirot confirms the victims didn't know each other or the killer, before we get a short scene of this guy again, who laughs in a library about the war. Back home, Poirot collects the family members of the victims together and makes Mary cry, while Megan mentions Betty had new stockings and Franklin says Lady Clark is doing poorly. Over the dishes, Poirot says he got deja vu during the meeting, and Hastings spaces out, and on the train, Poirot finds out that Hastings has been talking to the press. Poirot visits Lady Clark, who says Thora is a liar and she'd been talking to a stranger on the day of Carmichael's death, but doesn't remember any details. Donald says he needs to talk to Poirot as Hastings collects the mail.
Mr. Poirot, do you know anything about dreams?
I do.
There's one time a pie maker got shot from a window. Anyway, he says he dreams he's the killer as we zoom in on this letter, which Hastings finally notices. Get on that D, Poirot, because those spinning newspapers are out of control. And while Jap thinks they have ample time before the next murder, Franklin breaks the news that a big racing event is taking place that day, which complicates things. Poirot confronts Thora about the stranger, and she says he was a stocking salesman, which explains Poirot's deja vu, but Thora can't remember what he looked like. Mr. Cust is all sad, but still plans to go out, as Miss Marbury yammers on about the murders, and he of course is a stocking salesman. He walks past Jap on the train, and Thora says she feels foolish for not paying more attention. But shut up and get off the train, everyone. We've got a killer to catch. They make a plan for the next day and go their separate ways before Franklin says Lady Clark is batty and not to listen to any nonsense she's been saying. The day of the murder, Poirot briefs them all, with Thora rocking up late, and they all disperse across the racecourse as Cust has a good cry and Poirot seems to meditate. After a lot of stock footage of horses, Poirot rushes to Hastings to tell him that he figures that one of the murders was intentional and the rest are to cover it up. Oh, back at the movies, are we? Is this one from the right year this time? Well, not really. This one is number 17 from 1932, but at least it existed at the time. As Cust gets up, some dude is stabbed and the body is discovered swiftly afterwards, along with a railway guide. The police report it to Jap as Cust gets back and discovers blood on his hand, as well as the knife, so he screams dramatically and washes it off as the housekeeper walks in. She reports this to Jap and Poirot, who investigate his room, discovering the guy's initials are A.B.C. and that he's a stocking salesman, and they also discover the murder weapon. Mrs. Marbury says he doesn't seem the type, and after an exorcist-looking shot, Cust hears voices and stares into the camera before fainting in the police station. Cue the spinning newspapers. At court, Poirot and Hastings question if Cust is actually guilty, and Jap gets a visit from Mr. Strange, who gives him an airtight alibi for Betty's murder, which infuriates him, so Poirot goes to visit Cust. He says he didn't write the letters and that everyone's against him, and they have a chat about his silly name and how his job sent him letters telling him where to go and who to sell to. He also says he had a game of dominoes with a guy that told him his fate was to die on the gallows, and he mentions lapses in memory he gets from time to time. The murder club goes back to the scene of Betty's death, and Poirot launches into a lecture about how Cust is actually innocent because Betty removed her belt for the killer, which Cust was not capable of, and he was used by the real killer as a scapegoat. Cust went to his first job in Andover, where Alice wound up dead, then Bexhill, where Betty of course died, then Churston, where Carmichael died, and Poirot wonders who would benefit. Not Mary or Donald and Megan, but Carmichael was rich, which would give Thora a motive. And of course the guy in Doncaster bit the dust, but Carmichael's murder was the main one, and Franklin is looking guilty. He planted the murder weapon into Cust's pocket as he left the cinema, but he's mad and denies everything. However, Poirot says his fingerprints were on the typewriter found in Cust's room, so he makes a run for it into the theatre, where the police search for him in a rather tense scene, before he is caught and eyeballed by the murder club. Poirot explains that the third letter was deliberately mislabeled so the intended crime couldn't be prevented, and he admits that he lied about there being fingerprints on the typewriter. Spinning newspaper attack! Poirot is complaining about the smell of the crocodile when Jap and Cust pay a visit, the latter gifting him some flowers. And he's thrilled by Poirot's crocodile and Hastings' story that he's been dying to tell this whole episode, so Poirot and Jap sneak out. Okay, this one is a pretty famous one, but I wouldn't call it top tier like Death on the Nile and Murder on the Orient Express. However, it is rated the second best episode of the show. I love the premise. I love a fictional serial killer with a creative MO, and we had a good couple of victims, but call me greedy, I always want more, especially with such a large scope like the alphabet. The letters help by providing deadlines, which keeps the pace going, and I appreciate the touch of the calendar behind Jap in his office, and it never felt slow or plodding. The runtime is justified, and while there are a lot of characters, I don't mind it because there are 4 victims worth of families to talk to, and I like the little murder club Poirot created. I would have loved a little little more time spent with them trying to solve the crime. I'm not a big fan of the commit a bunch of murders to cover up one murder trope. It seems more likely to get them caught and detracts from the serial killer MO, especially with this one being so elaborate, and honestly, Franklin's reveal as the killer was a little anticlimactic. If there had been a little bit more time spent on the murder club, we could have had more setup for Franklin being the true killer, with small slip-ups or hints he was working against the group, which you could catch on a repeated watch. Instead, Poirot just kind of turns around and says, "Oh, by the way, it's that guy," which was a little dull. I have seen this episode before, but I couldn't remember who the killer was, just that it wasn't actually Cust. However, I worked out it was Franklin through process of elimination. Although Donald and his random dream was a weird red herring, how Cust was used, engineered into being at the scene of each of the murders, and his appearance throughout the episode was clever, and Donald Sumpter played the role with such depth and unease, which lended itself well to the mystery. But I'm still confused how Cust and Franklin actually met. Yeah, a random domino game, but how did Franklin know about Cust's medical conditions and history in the war? And how did he come up with a plan which, remember, was cooked up because of Cust's unique name, then executed that plan by sending letters to Cust who was moving around? I mean, I doubt someone would spill their medical history, employment status, and home address to a guy who told them they would end up at the gallows. Wonky logic aside, the A.B.C. murders was a fun watch with great character moments from Poirot, Hastings, and Jap, a decent body count, and some nice set pieces, so a good way to spend 100 minutes. We have 4 victims: Alice Asher, who was hit over the head in her shop in Andover, Elizabeth Betty Barnard, who was strangled by her own belt in Bexhill, Carmichael Clark, who received a blow to the head in Churston, and unnamed in this episode but apparently called George Earlsfield, that's weird, stabbed in a cinema in Doncaster by our killer Franklin Clark, who wanted to inherit his family's fortune and killed 3 other people in order to blame poor Alexander Bonaparte Cust. So there you have it. That was the A.B.C. murders. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, or come say hi on social media. If you enjoyed this video, then please hit that like button, it really does mean a lot, or consider subscribing if you want to keep investigating with me. Alternatively, feel free to check out my other YouTube channels. Thank you so much for watching, I'll speak to you soon, and keep an eye out for clues.